My wife keeps throwing the word divorce in my face over everything I do. I just said okay and left. It's hard to say exactly when things began to fall apart. I think looking back, the seeds of discontent were planted long before I realized we were headed toward the end. My wife and I had been together for 5 years and married for 4. We'd known each other for many years before that, but it felt like we really started to build a life together when we got married. We had a daughter, a beautiful, bright 4-year-old, and I'd always been the primary breadwinner in our family. For a while I thought we had a solid partnership, but it wasn't long before things started to feel different, though at the time I couldn't quite put my finger on it. My wife, after all, was my best friend, but we were constantly arguing about something or another. Looking back, it seems like the arguments were just small sparks that ignited bigger flames. And the one phrase she started throwing at me during every fight divorce changed everything. The first time she said it, I didn't take her seriously. We'd been arguing about something trivial. I can't even remember the specifics when she threw out that word. Divorce. I remember the way it stung in the air, but it wasn't enough to make me walk away. I tried to reason with her, tried to show her I cared, but she kept using that word as a weapon. She wasn't happy, and everything I did seemed to make it worse. At first I didn't think much of it, but it wasn't long before it became a regular occurrence in our fights. Every time I didn't do something right or failed to meet an expectation, divorce came up again, and it hurt each time more than the last. Then came the incident with my sister. She was having her own relationship problems and asked if she could stay with us for a little while. I didn't hesitate to say yes. I wanted to help. What I didn't expect was that my wife would be so angry. The fight we had over it was intense, but what really stung was the way my wife reacted to my sister staying with us. It wasn't just about the inconvenience, it felt like a rejection. She didn't want to deal with the disruption, and I didn't understand why. After all, her friend had stayed with us for weeks, not lifting a finger to help. I didn't mind that, but I was frustrated that my wife didn't see how helpful and pleasant my sister was in comparison. My sister stayed for a week, and she did everything: cooked, cleaned, helped with our daughter, and kept everything running smoothly. But things were already off between my wife and me. We were barely communicating, and the more I tried to make things work, the more she seemed to push me away. I suggested we go to therapy, but she dismissed the idea outright. "We don't need therapy," she'd say. "This is just a phase." But then came the argument about work. I was working long hours, trying to keep up with bills and the increasing demands on me. She accused me of abandoning her, of not being a good father. It hurt. I'd always been there for our daughter, attending doctor's appointments, school functions, everything. I'd always done my best to be a present and involved father, but no matter what I did, it was never enough. That's when the words came again: "I want a divorce." I couldn't believe it. I stood there stunned, trying to process what she was saying. The pain in her eyes was real, but it wasn't just her words that got to me, it was the way she said them, like she meant it. I responded as calmly as I could, pointing out that I worked so much because I had to. She wasn't working, and we couldn't make ends meet without me doing everything. Maybe I didn't say it the right way, but the frustration in my voice was raw. "This is my money," I said, and I immediately regretted it. I meant to say that our money was going to bills, savings, and expenses, but it came out wrong. But even when I tried to clarify, it felt like I couldn't make things right anymore. She was shutting down, and I couldn't find a way back. That was when I made the decision that would change everything. I packed a bag, grabbed my daughter's things, and left. I went to stay with my sister. The first few days were a blur of confusion and pain. My wife called, texted, apologized, and begged me to come back. She said she didn't mean it, that she was sorry for everything. She wanted counseling, therapy, all the things we'd never tried. She missed me. But I had made up my mind. I couldn't keep living this way. I had always promised myself that I wouldn't be like my father. He had left, and I grew up with that pain. I knew what it was like to be the child in a broken home, but every time we argued, every time she threatened divorce, I felt like I was already breaking. As time passed, I thought about what I wanted for myself, for my daughter. I wasn't perfect, and I knew that. But I couldn't raise her in a home where arguing and threats of divorce were normal. It wasn't healthy, and it wasn't what I wanted for her future. After I left, I took a hard look at everything. I talked with friends, family, and even started counseling on my own. One thing was clear: I couldn't change my wife. She needed to want help, and until she acknowledged that there was a problem, there was no way forward for us. I wanted us to work, but I couldn't force her to do the work. I had tried everything I could think of, but nothing was working. A few weeks later my wife and I sat down for a serious conversation. I told her that I was done with the fighting, done with the threats of divorce. I couldn't keep living in uncertainty, never knowing when the next argument would come or when she would bring up divorce again. She promised things would change. We agreed to go to couples therapy, and for a while it seemed like things were improving. She got a job. She started making new friends. She found a hobby. For the first time in a long time, I saw a glimmer of hope. But then one night, things took another turn. We had made plans regarding our daughter, and my wife completely forgot. She had other plans, and in the heat of the moment, an argument broke out. The words that came next shattered me. I knew marrying you was a mistake. The weight of those words hit me like a ton of bricks. I asked her to repeat herself, but it didn't matter. I knew right then that it was over. I took our daughter and left. We went to the plans we had, just the two of us. Later that day, I filed for legal separation. It was a decision I had thought long and hard about. We agreed to separate, live apart, but remain married. I would still support her with insurance and finances, but we would no longer share a life. We would work on ourselves separately, and I would have the majority of custody of our daughter. One day, while I had my daughter, I went to drop her off at my wife's house. It was supposed to be a routine exchange, but as I pulled up, I saw an unfamiliar car in the driveway. My heart sank. I rang the doorbell, and a shirtless man who looked barely older than a kid answered. He didn't know who I was. I asked for my wife, and when she came around the corner her face was a picture of shock. I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't the woman I once knew. At that moment I knew the end had come. The woman I had tried to fix, the one I had loved so deeply, was gone. She had moved on, and it was time for me to do the same. In a few months, when the legal separation period ends, I'll file for divorce. It's not something I ever wanted, but it's the reality now. My daughter is my priority, and I'm determined to raise her in a home where love, respect, and happiness are the foundation. I promised myself that I wouldn't repeat the mistakes of my past, and I'm doing everything I can to keep that promise. The road ahead won't be easy, but I'll do my best to show my daughter what love really looks like. And as for me, I'm learning to let go. A few months passed since I made the hardest decision of my life. The separation from my wife wasn't something I'd ever imagined I would be facing, especially after all the years we'd spent together, but I had come to accept that it was what needed to happen. I hadn't expected it to be easy. The emotional weight of it all was overwhelming at times, but I'd made the commitment to myself and to my daughter that I would move forward. I wasn't going to let my past define me, and I sure as hell wasn't going to let my daughter grow up in a house where dysfunction was the norm. The legal separation was coming to an end, and while I had never intended for it to drag on this long, it felt like the right time to make things final. My daughter was adjusting better than I expected, though I knew she still didn't fully understand why we weren't living under the same roof. She was too young to grasp the complexity of relationships, but I could see the toll it was taking on her when she would ask why I wasn't there at bedtime, or why mommy and daddy couldn't be in the same room without tension. The transition to shared custody had its challenges. My ex-wife and I had agreed to a 70-30 split, with me having the majority of custody. At first it was hard to navigate, but with each passing week I learned how to balance my responsibilities as a single parent with my own emotional recovery. It wasn't easy, but I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't had in a long time. I was no longer just holding on for the sake of holding on. I was living for myself, and most importantly, I was living for my daughter. As the months went by, I focused on rebuilding myself. I took a hard look at who I had become, and I realized that somewhere along the way I had lost myself in the role of a husband. I had put my entire identity into being a provider and a partner to the point where I had neglected my own needs, my own growth. I hadn't realized how much I'd sacrificed until I was living with my sister away from the constant stress of trying to make my marriage work. I started therapy not just to deal with the fallout of the separation, but to better understand my own emotional landscape. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to grieve. It wasn't just the end of my marriage, but the end of a dream I'd held onto for so long. It was painful to admit, but I had to accept that my marriage had been broken for a while, and no matter how much I wanted to fix it, I couldn't do it alone. Therapy helped me realize that I had been carrying a lot of weight on my shoulders for years. I had been trying to hold everything together not just for me, but for my daughter and for my wife. I had ignored the signs of distress in my own life because I was so focused on being the one who fixed everything. But fixing things wasn't enough. Sometimes it's okay to let go and accept that things aren't meant to be. I knew now that my daughter's happiness depended not just on me being there physically, but on me being emotionally healthy and present. I couldn't give her the love and stability she needed if I was still carrying the burden of a relationship. Meanwhile, my ex-wife was navigating her own journey. She had started seeing a therapist after we separated, and though I wasn't directly involved in her healing process, I hoped it was helping her in some way. After all, she had her own struggles and demons that I couldn't help her fight. We had our fair share of difficult conversations after the separation arguments, misunderstandings, and moments of clarity, but I could see that she was trying to work through her issues. The road to self-discovery wasn't linear, but at least it seemed like she was taking steps forward, however small they were. Still, I could feel the distance growing between us. I wasn't angry with her anymore. I had accepted that we had both made mistakes, but there was no turning back. The damage had been done, and as much as I once believed in the idea of reconciliation, I now saw that we were no longer the people we had once been. Our marriage had evolved into something toxic, and though there had been good moments, they were overshadowed by the arguments, the hurtful words, and the constant threats of divorce. At some point it became clear to both of us that we were no longer a good fit. Then came a moment I never expected, a moment that changed everything. It happened about 2 weeks before the legal separation was supposed to end. As usual, I rang the doorbell, and when my ex-wife opened the door, I noticed something different about her. It wasn't anything obvious, just a subtle change. Her posture was different, more confident, maybe a little more at peace with herself. For the first time, I didn't feel the usual tension between us. It was just calm. And for a brief moment, I saw the woman I had once fallen in love with. Not the angry, bitter version who had thrown around the word divorce every time things got hard, but the woman I remembered before all the hurt. She stood there for a moment looking at me, and then she said something I didn't expect. "I've been thinking a lot about us. I know we can't go back to what we had, but I hope we can at least be civil for her." She looked at our daughter, who was standing behind me, clutching my hand. It hit me then she wasn't just apologizing for her part in our failed marriage. She was acknowledging that we were both responsible for what happened. We were two people who had tried, but somewhere along the way we'd lost sight of each other. She wasn't asking for reconciliation, but she was asking for peace. And in that moment, I realized that I was ready to let go of the bitterness too. We didn't have a grand conversation about what our future would look like. We didn't need to. But something shifted that day. It wasn't about the marriage anymore. It was about being parents to our daughter. We agreed that we'd continue with the shared custody arrangement and work together to provide her with stability. It wouldn't be perfect, but it would be enough. We would no longer fight about petty things. We would no longer let the past define us. We would just focus on being the best co-parents we could be. The weeks that followed were filled with small steps. I still had my moments of doubt. Sometimes I missed what we once had, but I was finally starting to heal. Therapy was helping, and I began to reconnect with myself. I was doing things for me again, finding hobbies, pursuing passions I'd neglected for years. I was rediscovering who I was outside of being a husband, outside of being a father. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. My daughter was adjusting too. She seemed more comfortable with the changes. And though she still asked about why mommy and daddy didn't live together anymore, I could see that she wasn't troubled by it. She was loved, and that's all that mattered. I made sure of it. In the end, it wasn't the grand reunion I had once hoped for, but it was something better. It was peace. It was the realization that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let go of a relationship that's no longer healthy, and let go of the past that's holding you back. I was no longer the man who was stuck in a failing marriage, trying to fix everything. I was a father, a man who was learning to rebuild his life, and that was enough. I had done the hard work, and now it was time to live the life I deserved and the life I wanted to give my daughter. The road ahead was uncertain, but I was no longer afraid of what came next. For the first time in a long time, I was ready to move forward. And for her, my daughter, there was nothing I wouldn't do.